May 1944. The hills around Monte Cassino in Italy are on fire. Not literally, not yet, but close enough. German artillery has the entire slope zeroed in, and Allied gun crews are burning through ammunition faster than the supply trucks can bring it up. Every shell has to be carried, by hand, from the trucks to the guns, across open ground, while the enemy is actively trying to kill whoever's carrying it. Men are running this gauntlet all day, dropping from exhaustion, getting hit, going right back for more, because the guns can't stop firing. And in the middle of that chaos, walking upright on two legs, is something that has absolutely no business being on a battlefield. A 6-foot brown bear, carrying a 100-pound crate of artillery shells in his arms, like it's nothing. He never drops one. Not once. For us, having a rough day at work means a long meeting or a bad commute. For the exhausted, terrified men on that hillside, a literal bear had joined their supply chain and was outworking half of them. His name was Wojtek, and this is the true story of how a bear ended up fighting the Nazis. To get to that hillside, you have to go back 2 years earlier to 1942 in the mountains of Iran. And to understand why a Polish army was even there, you need a bit of brutal context first. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the Soviet Union invaded from the other side days later, carving the country up between them under a secret pact. Tens of thousands of Polish soldiers were taken prisoner and shipped off to Soviet labor camps scattered across Siberia and Central Asia, where a huge number of them wouldn't survive the conditions. It wasn't until 1941, when Hitler broke his pact with Stalin and invaded the USSR, that the Soviets suddenly needed Poland as an ally instead of a captured enemy. So, somewhat reluctantly, they agreed to release the surviving Polish prisoners, who then formed a new fighting force known as the Polish Anders Army, named after the general who led it. What followed was a brutal, sprawling trek, tens of thousands of soldiers and civilian refugees moving south, out of Soviet territory, through Uzbekistan and then Persia, many of them already sick, starving, and broken from years in the camps, all trying to reach British-controlled territory in the Middle East where they could reorganize and eventually rejoin the wider Allied war effort. Somewhere along that route, near a town called Hamadan in the Iranian mountains, a group of Polish soldiers ran into a local boy carrying a burlap sack. Inside was a bear cub, barely a few weeks old, orphaned after hunters had shot his mother, and clearly starving, barely able to stand. The soldiers themselves had almost nothing. They were refugees from a labor camp, weeks into an exhausting march. But they scraped together what little they had, some tins of meat, a pocket knife, a bit of chocolate, and traded it for the cub's life. They named him Wojtek. Roughly, it translates to smiling warrior, or he who enjoys war. Considering what he was about to become, that name turned out to be almost unfairly perfect. At first, he had to be bottle-fed condensed milk out of an old vodka bottle with a rag stuffed in as an improvised nipple, since nobody in a military convoy in the middle of the desert had baby bottles lying around. He was clumsy, tiny, prone to tripping over his own paws, and within days had become, without question, the most popular soldier in the unit. Bears don't stay small. Within about a year, as the unit moved from Iran through Iraq and eventually into British-controlled Palestine and Egypt for training, Wojtek had grown into a 6-foot, 200-pound animal, and by then, he wasn't just tolerated by the unit, he was fully embedded in daily life, in ways that went well beyond a typical mascot. He slept in the men's tents, often curling up against whichever soldier was cold that night. He wrestled with them for fun, and by most accounts, held his own against grown men without ever actually hurting anyone. He seemed to understand, somehow, exactly how much force was play and how much wasn't. He'd been taught, somewhere along the way, to salute when greeted, which he'd perform on command like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, standing upright on his hind legs and raising a paw to his snout. He developed a genuine taste for beer, handed out as an occasional reward, and would reportedly get visibly frustrated if a bottle was taken away before he'd finished it. He also picked up a habit of stealing cigarettes straight out of soldiers' shirt pockets, not to smoke them, just to eat them, chewing through the paper and tobacco like a treat, which somehow became one of his more endearing and expensive quirks. He loved bathing more than almost anything else in his life, and soldiers would regularly find him climbing directly into water tanks or makeshift shower stalls, splashing around for as long as they'd let him, completely unbothered by an audience. He also loved wrestling matches, specifically with the camp's other unofficial mascot, a stray dog the unit had also taken in, and the two of them would tumble around camp together in ways that reportedly became one of the more reliable sources of entertainment for exhausted soldiers with nothing else to do. To the men of the 22nd Artillery Supply Company, he wasn't a mascot kept at arm's length for the occasional photo. He was one of them, in every practical sense that mattered, and treated with the same mix of affection and mild exasperation you'd give any other soldier in the unit. By 1943, the unit got new orders, moved from Egypt to Italy, by ship, to join the Allied invasion of the mainland. And that created a genuinely serious problem, one that could have ended Wojtek's story right there. British military transport regulations were strict and specific. No civilians, no pets, no unofficial animal mascots aboard troop transport ships. Wojtek, officially, fell into exactly that gray area. Not a soldier, not equipment, just a very large bear the men happened to have adopted over the last year. Which meant, by the letter of the regulations, he could legally be left behind in Egypt, and there was a real possibility that's exactly what would happen. The men were not willing to let that happen, so they came up with a solution that was equal parts clever, bureaucratic, and completely ridiculous. They enlisted him. Wojtek was formally given the rank of private, and later promoted to corporal, in the Polish II Corps. He was issued his own official paybook, his own serial number, his own daily rations, listed on paper right alongside every human soldier's, which in practice meant an allocation of food that the men would then supplement with fruit, honey, and the occasional beer. On official military documents, filed and stamped through the proper channels, Wojtek the Bear was not a mascot, not a pet, not an exception to policy. He was, on paper, a soldier, which meant he could board that ship completely within the rules, no special favors required, because technically none were being asked for. In early 1944, the Polish II Corps was thrown into one of the deadliest, most drawn-out battles of the entire Italian campaign, the Battle of Monte Cassino. German forces held a heavily fortified position on the mountaintop, anchored around a centuries-old monastery, and by the time the Poles arrived that spring, Allied troops from several nations had already taken catastrophic losses over months trying to break the position. Wojtek's unit was part of the artillery supply chain, which meant one brutal, repetitive, exhausting job, hauling heavy wooden crates of ammunition, some loaded with shells weighing close to 100 pounds, from delivery trucks up to the guns, over and over, for hours at a stretch, across exposed ground, while German artillery on the mountain above tried to zero in on exactly that kind of movement. This is where Wojtek did the thing that soldiers who witnessed it never stopped talking about for the rest of their lives. He'd watched the men lift these crates for weeks by that point, moving supplies around camp during quieter periods. And during the battle itself, he simply started copying them, picking up a crate himself, holding it against his chest the way he'd seen the men do, and carrying it, entirely on his own initiative, all the way to the gun crews, exactly like every human soldier in the line. He kept doing it, all day, for the length of the engagement, back and forth, tirelessly, never once dropping a single crate, even as explosions landed close enough to rattle the ground under his feet. Nobody had trained him to do this. There was no order given, no reward dangled in front of him to make it happen. Witnesses who were there swore, in interviews given decades later, that he seemed to genuinely grasp what was happening around him, that the men needed help, that this mattered, and that he was capable of giving it, so he simply did. The battle was eventually won after brutal, sustained fighting, opening the road to Rome for the Allies. And in recognition of what he'd done throughout the engagement, the leadership of the 22nd Company made an official decision that went well beyond a nice story to tell afterward. They changed the unit's insignia entirely. From that point forward, their official emblem was a brown bear carrying an artillery shell, an image that Polish veterans of that specific unit wore stitched onto their uniforms for the remainder of the war, and that some veterans continued wearing on reunion jackets decades later. The war didn't end for Wojtek's unit right after Monte Cassino. There were more months of fighting through Italy ahead of them, but his role in the supply chain had, by that point, become something the whole company genuinely relied on rather than merely enjoyed having around. He continued moving supplies during later engagements, and soldiers began deliberately including him in work details the way they would any capable pair of hands, because by this point, that's effectively what he was. He also became something of an informal morale system in his own right. Men who'd lost friends in the fighting at Monte Cassino were, by multiple accounts, drawn to spend time with him specifically, sitting with him, feeding him, using his presence as something to hold on to in the gaps between engagements when there wasn't much else available. When the war in Europe ended, Wojtek's unit was eventually demobilized in Scotland, near Berwickshire, and Wojtek went with them, crossing an entire continent one more time with the men he'd spent the war beside. For a while, life carried on more or less as it always had in camp. Except now, Scottish villagers and reporters started coming out specifically to see the famous soldier bear, and word of him spread quickly beyond the regiment itself. He became something of a genuine local celebrity, reportedly even appearing on a Scottish radio broadcast and, by some accounts, a children's television segment, charming an entirely new audience that had never set foot near a battlefield. But eventually, the practical reality set in. The soldiers had to be discharged and returned to ordinary civilian life. Jobs, families, small flats, and a fully grown Syrian brown bear obviously couldn't move into any of that with them. So in 1947, with what by every account was a great deal of heartbreak on both sides, his former comrades arranged for him to live out his remaining years at the Edinburgh Zoo. He stayed there for the rest of his life. And the men who'd served beside him didn't simply move on and quietly forget about him the way you might expect. Many of them came back to visit over the years, some traveling a considerable distance to do it, and multiple witnesses independently described the same thing happening each time. When former Polish soldiers called out to him in Polish or climbed the enclosure fence to greet him the way they used to back in camp, Wojtek recognized them instantly, every single time, no matter how many years had passed since they'd last stood beside him. He died in 1963, at the age of 21. Today, Wojtek is remembered with statues in Edinburgh, Krakow, and London, a bear in uniform, mid-stride, permanently carrying a shell toward a gun that no longer needs it, frozen in the exact motion that made him legendary. It would be easy enough to file this whole thing away as a strange, charming footnote in military history, a fun fact to bring up at dinner. But underneath it, it's really a story about what people cling to when everything around them is specifically designed to grind them down. A group of exhausted, traumatized soldiers, men who'd survived Soviet labor camps, a brutal march across 3 countries, and some of the bloodiest fighting of the entire Italian campaign, found something to protect, something to care for, something that made a genuinely impossible war a little more bearable to live through day to day. And that bond somehow carried a starving, orphaned cub from a burlap sack in the mountains of Iran, all the way to a battlefield in Italy, and finally to 3 separate statues that still stand today, in 3 different countries, more than 70 years after he carried his last crate of shells. If you like this one, there are more stories just like it. Animals who got swept into the middle of human history and quietly became part of it. Subscribe if you want the next one.